Hello, everyone. Welcome back to All Things Avennia. So great to see all your faces. This is legit an episode. I know it's April Fool's Day, so I hope that people didn't see that and think, "Oh, he's not actually going to talk about wine fraud or do this whole thing." It's April Fool's Day, but we are here, and I'm really excited about this conversation. I think it can go in a lot of different directions, which is, I think, what makes it really enjoyable and interesting. And you might have seen we have the next 2 months all scheduled out. So take a look and see if there's any particular interests that you want to make sure you schedule in and join us for those weeks. There's gonna be some really fun stuff, some really awesome people that I'm gonna be interviewing too. I'll definitely especially point out Erica Orr, the winemaker and consultant, and Lacey Liebeck, one of our growers and managers in Sagemore. I'm super excited about those conversations. So those will be in May, but definitely get those on your calendar. And I guess what we'll do now, we'll just go right into this presentation. The idea was to talk about wine fraud and fake wine, counterfeit wine, the history of it. And then I had a little assignment that I hope most of you did, which was to watch Sour Grapes, a documentary made in 2016 about a very famous wine fraud scandal. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk about wine fraud, but then even have a discussion about the movie and see what you guys thought. I definitely have some ideas and opinions, but I want to hear what everyone thinks. But before that, we'll just go and I'm going to share my screen so we can look at a little wine fraud history. So there are three main types of wine fraud. A lot of people say there's actually only two main types of wine fraud. You can either mess with the packaging or you can mess with the liquid. And in some ways that's true. We have adulteration, which is where you can change the actual wine itself by either blending in chemicals, sweeteners, juice, other types of wine from different origin or different regions that don't actually match where they're supposed to be. So you can mess with the wine itself. You can also counterfeit the actual packaging. So this is the label, the capsule, the cork, the bottle, relabeling, rare or inexpensive, inferior wines as really rare, unicorn wines, things that are really hard to find. And then the third type, though, that I would like to include is more of a general fraud, and this is the idea of, manipulation of investment wine, of the investment side of the business. So this is when you can inflate prices of off vintages, which is actually something that Rudy Kurniawan did in Sour Grapes. You can sell extremely high to investors before you plan on liquidating, and there's lots of other just sort of generic fraudulent things you can do in the wine business. But most of what we're talking about is the first two, the adulteration and counterfeiting. For a long time, though, there was other things considered fraudulent that no longer are, or it really actually depends on where you are. There's laws in France, for instance, that will allow some of these things, depending on the climate or where you are, and might not allow others, and it might be different. So, for instance, for a long time, it was considered fraudulent to add spirits, to add grape spirits or brandy to fortify wine. Obviously, that's not fraudulent anymore. Some of the best dessert wines like port and Madeira and sherry are purposely fortified. That's part of the style. They realized that it was able to strengthen the wine so they could last a longer ocean voyage, and so that was a great thing. But at one point, that was considered fraudulent. Adding water or even oak aging and oak chips, anything that was adding flavorings for a while, some people would think that was considered fake wine. Chaptalization, which is the process of adding sugar before fermentation to boost your alcohol levels. There are places in Europe and in France, especially in the northern climates where it might be a little cold and you don't get grapes that get as ripe, where you are allowed to chaptalize, where you're allowed to put sugar, but you're definitely not allowed to chaptalize in like the southern Rhone or in Provence, in the southern part of France. But a lot of these things, stirring the lees, cold maceration, microoxygenation, cultured yeast, a lot of these things are very normal parts of the wine industry now, but just to explain over history and over many years, these are the types of things that at one point people considered fraud. And I wanted to remember that too, because when we get to the end and talk about all the other ways that now we think of wine as being fake or counterfeit, who knows? Maybe in someday people won't even care if it's a new label or if it's the same wine but put in a different bottle and recorked. Tastes are always changing. People are always changing. But if we go way back, You basically can guess that as long as there's been wine, there's probably been some fraudsters out there that want to mess with you. So as early as ancient Rome, in the before the changeover from BC to AD. I didn't want to do exact dates because it's not really the point, but there's Pliny the Elder who kept a lot of records, historian, talked a lot about the fraudulent wine that was rampant among the Romans, even up into the nobility. They weren't even sure if a lot of the wine the nobles were drinking were actually true or fake. The original cult wine, Falernian, so there's a Falernian wine that was written in lots of different histories, that was at one point found in all the local bars and local taverns. They had all this Falernian wine that there was just no way it all could have come from that one area in Italy. So even the Romans were dealing with it. In the Middle Ages, questionable wines were sold all over the place, and it got to the point where there were some laws that came in place. In London, they passed law where they forced taverns and wineries to separate sellers by origin. So if you've got French wine imported or Spanish wine or Italian or German, those had to be in separate cellars so that you couldn't actually mix them. Because at this point, remember, they're not in bottles. These were sold in casks or in big oak barrels. So it was a little easier to take some out and blend it with something else and then pretend that you can sell something for a higher price, even though you shouldn't. Germany even had laws that would threaten branding. They'd brand you if they caught you, they'd beat you, and even hang you to death for wine fraud. So it's always been something that people were trying to find a way to prevent. And then Age of Enlightenment, by the 17th, 18th century, science becomes big. This is when everyone was starting to discover many more chemicals and just general scientific discoveries. And then we had wine doctors who realized if I started adding chemicals to wine or use fruits from other like apples or sloe berries, made a juice that you could kind of make into Bordeaux wine. So you started getting a lot of wine doctors just creating wine out of nothing and selling it on the market. Not good stuff. And so by the early 1800s, a lot of writers were actually the ones who started noticing all the wine fraud, all these counterfeit wines, or wines that had no traceability, that you couldn't really figure out where they came from. And so the British Parliament was actually one of the first ones to pass a law, the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act in 1860. France followed by passing a law that officially defined wine as a product of fermented grape juice. And then eventually Germany and Italy does too. But this was all during the same time as this guy, phylloxera. So I think we mentioned phylloxera briefly, maybe in talking about viticulture, but this was a root louse that arrived in Europe in the late 1800s and just completely decimated the wine industry. It started actually in England, but it wasn't until it arrived in France in the Rhone Valley in the 1860s that it took off and spread and ruined a lot of French wine. And so during this time, there was still a demand for French wine. There's still the demand to drink great French wine. And so a lot of producers, merchants, would import wines from other places in Europe. They'd take wine from Spain or Italy or Turkey or anywhere they can get their hands on, even Northern Africa. And they would take wines and blend it with the wines they could make in France. And then they would also create or make different types of wine. They had a thing called raisin wine, where they would actually just take raisins, rehydrate them, and then ferment that into to wine. Sugar wine, piquettes, which was made from steeping the pressed grape skin. So after you process it for once, you would take it and press it again, try to get even more flavor out of there, but add water, add sugar, and then make a wine product out of that. And blending, they just started blending wines from all over. Champagne was really the one region where it didn't get as affected, and this is because they were already selling wine in bottles, just because the way that champagne is made, which we'll talk about more next week because we're doing sparkling wines next week. But those actually have to be made in bottle to get those bubbles. So it was a lot harder to counterfeit those wines at that time. And then Bordeaux, though, this was one of the reasons Bordeaux started moving to more estate bottling in the early 1900s, was because there was so much fraud and they wanted to protect their name. And then After phylloxera, or as phylloxera started calming down, because we realized we could use American rootstock and replant vineyards and be okay. Producers just couldn't compete with all this fraudulent wine. Prices plummeted. There was lots of protests, and this is just one of the many things that helped lead to the system, the appellation system, the appellation d'origine contrôlée in French, which was in 1935, and that's what really set rules and guidelines for French wine. But that was also the model for all of the other appellation type laws in other countries around the world. But what about us? What about the US? You know, I like talking about Prohibition. So during the 1920s, there's obviously going to be fraud. When you outlaw something, you're just asking for fraudulent wine. But I thought there was a couple interesting stories where grape merchants would sell bricks of grape. That top picture right there is a grape brick. So it's a brick of grape concentrate. But they would send it with a packet of dried yeast and a warning label and basically say, make sure you don't mix the yeast with this brick and some water and sugar, or else you might have an illegal alcoholic beverage. So, you know, just covering all their bases. But that was a way for a lot of people to make their own wine during Prohibition. The other pattern was, because, you know, one of the few exceptions in the law was sacramental wine. There were a lot of new Jewish families. The Jewish people were allowed. They actually had a certain amount of wine allocated to them per adult in the household, that they could use for sacramental purposes. And this is because, you know, in Christian churches, Catholic churches, a lot of the sacramental wine was used in church services. You actually had to be at church to use it. But in the Jewish tradition, a lot of sacramental drinking and a lot of rituals and religious things were done in the home. It was done over seders and in certain more communal table, you know, consumption and rituals. And so this was a lot of people became rabbis just magically. All of a sudden, there's a tenfold increase in the amount of Jewish rabbis and families who, in the 1920s, were able to get wine for their ceremonies. And then, I know it's not wine, but there was also an epidemic of sick citizens, because if you could get a doctor to sign off that you were sick, and I don't know if it was this particular illness, but whiskey in that day could be considered medical, almost like medical marijuana now. And you would be able to get a pint of whiskey every 10 days for this sickness. And so there was just a huge epidemic in the US of sick people drinking whiskey during Prohibition. I think this is more American ingenuity than anything fraudulent, but that's up for debate. And then we get to some of the biggest wine scandals in history, at least some of the ones that you might have heard of. So around 1985, they had discovered that all of a sudden Austrian wines had something in them that they shouldn't. It was known as the antifreeze wine scandal. But a little backstory. So in the late 70s and throughout the 60s and 70s, the Germans in particular were really starting to like Austrian wines and wanted to import more Austrian wines. And they liked sweeter wines. They had a few wines from Austria that got great reviews and good write-ups, and there was a higher and higher demand for those wines. And so that combination, and there was other combination, they were increasing planting a lot too, for different reasons, and just the industry was growing in general. And then they had some poor vintages, though. In the late 70s and early 80s, there were some vintages that it was hard to produce really ripe grapes and really good wines, but also those famous sweet wines where you really need long hang time and the right conditions to make sweet wines. So there were many producers, with the help of a chemist by the name of Otto Nadrasky, who found that you could use diethylene glycol, or DG, and add it in very trace amounts into the wine that would give it a little extra body, a little extra richness. It was odorless. You couldn't smell it, couldn't taste it, although it did taste a little sweet. So that was the only thing. That was the one thing it added, is it added a little sweetness and richness to wines that were too thin, but there was such a demand. So they said, you know what? Let's use this substance. Now this is used in brake fluids, lubricants, skincare products, and yes, antifreeze. And it is technically a poisonous thing. You don't want to drink antifreeze, but a lethal dose is around 40 grams per liter, whereas they were adding anywhere from a fraction of a gram to up to a couple grams per liter in the wines. And so in 1985, they were caught actually because one of the winemakers tried to claim it as a legit business expense on their taxes. And that was a red flag, and it was enough to send in some detectives to find out what was happening. And they realized that this had been going on for a few years, since started in 1978 by that Otto Nadrasky. Of course, this is the kind of story that media loves, and so the world media latched on and really drove home this antifreeze wine angle. And so a lot of people, when I first found out about it, I just assumed they were adding antifreeze to their wines, and a bunch of people died, and it was this terrible poisonous event, and it stained the Austrian wine reputation for years. Sales definitely dropped in Austria for many years, but there was still no proof that anyone actually died or got poisoned from these wines. Again, they were in really trace amounts, but because of that media angle, because of that story, and blowing it out of proportion, it just decimated the wine industry in Austria. Silver lining, Austria now is probably one of the tightest, most restricted, most highly regulated wine regions in the world. And they make beautiful, beautiful wine, but it really was because of this event. In 1986, they passed the Austrian Wine Act with those stricter regulations. And again, to this day, they're considered just beautiful wines, very, very science. They'll submit all of their wines to tasting to labs and make sure that everything is clean. And so I guess in some ways it ended up helping them in the long run, even though it was a big deal back then. Another thing happening around the same time, this 1985, was when the first Thomas Jefferson bottle was sold. So I actually have the book here. If you've read Billionaire's Vinegar, it's a fascinating little book about this whole scandal. So at the time, and I don't know, I'll have to check if this still is the most expensive wine ever sold, and it looks like we're missing a little. I might have deleted something without putting it. It says that the Chateau Lafite 1787 engraved with the THJ, assumed to be Thomas Jefferson, sold for a record $15. Sorry, it's not $15. It's $156,000. So I'll change that. But at the time, this was a really big deal. It was bought by the Forbes family. But already there was a lot of sketchy things going on. And in total, there's a few dozen, I think, bottles that were found by this guy, Hardy Rodenstock. His real name was Meinhard Goerke. He was a pop music manager and sort of man about town in Germany for a long time. He was a wine collector, but apparently he found these really old, rare bottles engraved with Thomas Jefferson's initials behind this brick wall in a basement cellar in Paris. And it was such an amazing find. He ended up hosting these lavish parties with reviewers and tastemakers and some of the best wine writers in the world, and would give them all this wine and then bring out these amazing special bottles and have people taste them. And it really drummed up a lot of interest and support, cachet for this guy's cellar and for his collection. And so when he gave these bottles to Christie's auction to sell in 1985 under Michael Broadbent's direction, they thought, this is great. This is going to be an amazing historical find. And so they sold the first bottle. A couple other bottles were sold to billionaire Bill Koch, who we'll get back to when we talk about sour grapes. And then after a while, Bill Koch was going to present them. So fast forward 20 years, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts wanted to feature these bottles as part of a Jefferson feature. So they asked Bill to bring them up, but they wanted to know the provenance. They wanted to know where they came from. And so this is what began a pretty long investigation to figure this out. And they actually went to the Thomas Jefferson Foundation in Monticello, who basically confirmed that there's no way that these bottles could be real. That the bottles in question, there were a couple of different issues. First of all, Jefferson was a meticulous record keeper, and they have lots of records of wine that he purchased during this time. And not once was there a record of the 1787 vintage ever being purchased by him. There's the little detail, the fact that his initials were TH period J period, whereas Thomas Jefferson always used TH colon J period, when he used his initials. Little things like this that started hinting that something could be amiss. And so Bill Koch hires former FBI agent Jim Elroy, who helps lead this pursuit to try to figure out what's this Rodenstock guy? Where did he actually get these bottles? They even discovered that the engraving itself is very unlikely that it was made back then, because of the kind of engraving it was under microscope could only have been made by an electric mechanical type tool, almost like a dentist tool. So, Koch finally brings a suit against Rodenstock, but since he's in Germany, he basically claims that the judge has no jurisdiction over him, that the statute of limitations is up because this was back in the late 80s. And so there was this legal battle back and forth, and Bill Koch trying to sue this guy. But actually, nothing ever actually happened. He never showed up. He just stayed in Germany. And I think there might have been a settlement at some point because he ended up selling the Chicago wine auction instead of this guy, and maybe got a settlement out of that. But Rodenstock ended up living. He passed away in 2018. As he would still host parties, but I guess he would charge a little money this time for them. But one of the unsolved mysteries, but also everyone sort of assumes that he was a sketchy character. And since then, I mean, there is just so much fraud happening. So this is just some of the articles and some of the things I've found even in the last decade. And these are different kinds of fraud. Obviously, this first one, Robert Parker, this was a famous fraud allegation where he sued Antonio Galloni, who's a guy who eventually branched off from Wine Advocate and set up Venice. And that was just because he refused to post reviews of Sonoma that he was paid to review by Wine Advocate before he left. A lot of back and forth. There's been, over a few years, 60 million bottles of wine with no designation of origin were bottled as Côte d'Aron Village, and Châteauneuf du Pape by a trading company called Raphael Michel in France. There were a bunch of Canadians who were caught getting bulk Italian wine and relabeling it as Chianti and Monticello or all the not Monticello, Montepulciano d'Abruzzo and all these appellations that they weren't. There was a wine store owner, John Fox, in Berkeley, California, who got sentenced $45 million for a Ponzi scheme, or sentenced for 6 years because he made $45 million in this scheme where he told people he had these rare wines coming and they should pay him ahead of time, and the wines never showed, and he ended up just buying Maseratis and cars because that's what these people do. 2018, the big story in Bordeaux, one of the biggest Bordeaux fraud cases, was the Grand Vin de Gironde. Was found wrongly labeling a whole bunch of wine, 600,000 liters of wine. And this was just generic wine that they labeled as Saint-Estèphe or Saint-Emilion, and they were forced to pay a huge fine. And even more recently, they found 130,000 cases of counterfeit Italian wine of Oltreppo Pavese in northern Italy. So this is happening, this is still going on. And this brings us to sour grapes. So, for those of you that hopefully you all got a chance to watch, if you didn't, I'll run through to the major points, and that way when I get off when I take it off screen share, you'll at least have the primer if you didn't just watch it like Renee did. So wine auctions have been around for a long time. Like I said, we were talking about the 1985 auction of the billionaire's vinegar, but it really started booming in that .com bubble in the late 90s. Rudy Kurniawan was started to buy these really rare wines, especially Burgundy, and ended up driving up prices dramatically. And in 2006, he joins with John Capon of Acker, Maryland Condit, and consigns 2 major lots of his wines. And between the 2 lots, sells around $35 million worth of these wines that he supposedly had purchased or were part of his private cellar. And then in 2008, he tried to sell a bunch of Domaine Ponceau Clos Saint-Denis, from vintages that ranged from 1945 to 1971. The problem was that the gentleman, Laurent Ponceau, the guy who owns Domaine Ponceau from the family, the winemaker, showed up and basically said, they actually didn't start bottling it until 1982, that there's absolutely no way these wines are real. And so Ponceau showed up and forced John Capon at that auction to remove the lot, which they did. But that really started sending some flags around about these wines. And there was a couple other instances. In the 2006 auctions, he sold a bunch of magnums of 1947 Chateau Lafleur. I think he sold 8 magnums. The problem was that they only actually ever produced 5, so some of those had to be fake. There was another issue in 2007 that someone caught of him selling wines at another auction. So at this point, and of course, we got our friend Bill Koch here, who was the one who bought some of those Thomas Jefferson bottles, has also bought lots of Rudy Kurniawan's bottles. And by 2009, he gets a little tired of hearing about it, and so he files a lawsuit. He hires that investigator to track down and figure out who's this Rudy guy, where is he getting all his money, and what's the deal. And so over the next few years, they do that investigation. They trace his roots back to Indonesia. They figure out that it's his uncle, his mother's brothers that could possibly be funding him, because they actually pulled off a bank heist and got millions of dollars that sort of disappeared, and they have no idea where it went. And in the whole time, more and more of his bottles are being pulled from auctions. So in 2012, Spectrum pulled some of his lots. And so by the time we get to his arrest on March 8th, 2012, they arrest him, raid his house, and they uncovered just the jackpot of evidence. So this is all the stacks of counterfeit labels, empty bottles, recorking machines, just old vintages. He had these bottles where he was writing recipes of how he could recreate the wine that was inside them to closely match how it should actually taste. And so the next year is when he actually goes on trial, and they find him guilty, sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was actually released from prison recently, so this is post-documentary. In 2020, he was released from prison, but he is awaiting deportation. So he was actually, even before this trial, he was in the country illegally, and so that's where he is now. As far as I know, is the most recent thing I could see was from November of last year, that he's still being detained and waiting to be deported. So the rise and fall of Rudy here. And then lastly, these are just some of the thoughts and questions I thought we could talk about in a minute. This is one of the questions brought up by the investigator and Maureen Downey, who was that blonde woman who did a lot of the forensic analysis, and she actually runs a really cool. She runs a website called winefraud.com, and is one of the crusaders trying to get more and more people aware of this issue and teaching more people to identify fraudulent and counterfeit wines. It's amazing stuff. But they basically ask the question, should we be regulating wine more? Should we have more regulations on labeling, on capsules, on making sure that we can trace and track wine as it goes through from owner to owner? And then some ideas of, why is art, or wine in this case, valuable? Is wine valuable to these wealthy wine collectors because of its authenticity or because of its provenance? And it was owned by this person and it came from this vintage, absolutely? Or is it how it makes you feel? Like, does it make you feel great to see that art on the wall? Does it make you just feel emotional to own these bottles? And then lastly, a lot, I used to think too, like, wine fraud, this doesn't really affect me. This is just the really wealthy people and rare old wines. But it's actually becoming clear there's a lot of wine fraud even on the more generic level. And part of the reason, and this Maureen Downey talks about this a lot, since the punishment is so low, the risk is so low, you might get fined or get a slap on the wrist, but it's not like human trafficking or drug trafficking, that now organized crime groups are really getting involved on a larger scale and promoting and counterfeiting wine and selling it. It's another commodity that they can manipulate. Even right now, the Miraval Rosé. So for Brangelina friends, the Rosé by Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt estate in Provence, that's being counterfeited by Chinese merchants. The Chinese market in general is the place where they think a lot of fraud, fake wine is now, just because it's an exponentially increasing market with a lot of people that are just now learning about European wine. So it's a lot easier to manipulate and to hide things in the market, which is unfortunate. So that's that's your little brief history on wine fraud, and I thought at this time we could open it up. And if some of you wanted to share, if you had a chance to watch sour grapes recently. I just want to know what you all thought. If something stuck out to you that you wanted to share or that we might discuss, or if you just had any comments about the presentation, also about you know how crazy some of these people are, because they're crazy. So yeah,
And
Renee.
for me, it was just frustrating not to really know what happened, how he did it, what he did.
Right,
There's still so many gaps in the story. That was frustrating.
And he
right,
must have
like
been pretty talented to get the wine close enough to fool a lot
right.
of people.
Well, and that's the thing. They talked a lot about how he was a really knowledgeable taster and a great taster. Like you have to have a certain um, level of expertise to know to get something as close to mimic these super old rare wines. And so yeah, the fact that he had these recipes on the back where he knew that he needed this very particular vintage of this Bordeaux wine with an oxidized Napa cab with just a little bit, it does take it's a very they talked about, is he more of a chemist or is he more of like this master blender, which is what they also thought of Hardy Rodenstock. Hardy Rodenstock had this reputation, the billionaire's vinegar guy, had this reputation of being a master blender and being able to create wines that tasted amazing. But yeah, the whole idea that there was 10,000 bottles and it takes you an hour to do everyone. There's no way he could have done it by himself. So
Yeah, yeah.
it is interesting to know sort of the unanswered questions.
Yeah, I just assumed at his house he would come up with the recipes and then have someone else recreate it.
Yeah, and well, and then there's his brother too, because I was interested too. His
Right.
brother came into the story, and then you start thinking, well, maybe he did have some extra help in doing all of that. Um, but yeah, and the fact that no one else has been charged. He's the only person out of this whole scandal that's had to spend time or get fined or anything. When you know that, I mean, I just have a feeling the Acker and Merrill group
Yeah.
um, was had to know something. They had to know something was up. So.
Yeah.
What was interesting for me is the lawyer that they that prosecuted him. It was in another documentary that I recently saw about art fraud in a New York City gallery. So this guy must not believe anything that he sees is for sale in like the high-end market. But I did have like a two-part question for you.
Yeah.
One is, working in like New York City restaurants with like really expensive bottles of wine, or Seattle with really expensive bottles of wine, is there like cautionary tales amongst wine people, or have you ever, like the woman who I think you mentioned has the blog said her first like counterfeit bottle of wine she could tell because it was so light compared to what it was? And that's the first part. And the second part is, if you as a sommelier had a chance to taste a real but exorbitantly expensive wine that like someone like a Coke could buy, what would it be?
Oh boy, I'll answer the second one first, just because to me, like, I want to taste a wine that's as old as can be that still tastes good, and so it would probably be a dessert wine like a port or a sauterne, something that like a sweet wine that can really last and just get crazy. In the movie, the guy was like, "Oh, I drank so much of that 1907 Madeira. It tastes like coconut and espresso." And like, as much as I didn't like that guy at all. I was like, man, that sounds good. I want to try some really really old Madeira. That sounds fun. But to answer your first question, so yeah, there's stories. It's hard, and I was reading, the restaurant itself is actually one of the weakest links in catching wine fraud, in instilling some way to authenticate things. A lot of the auction houses now, especially because of Rudy and this whole situation, have gotten a lot better at tracking things and inspecting and making sure they're selling good wines. But the restaurants, it's hard. A lot of times it's also because it's not just one person inspecting it. You have a staff of sommeliers, wine directors, servers, bartenders, anyone who might be touching these bottles, that might not even think to look or to lift, to touch and examine any of the wines. And a lot of times, a lot of restaurants don't have very many wines of that provenance or of that level, those super rare wines. I have heard stories, a lot of, and this goes back to the movie too, how he Rudy would contact restaurants where he would have these huge parties and open all these rare bottles, but then he'd email them and be like, "Hey, could you ship me those empty bottles? I want to keep them, or I want to. It's like art to me, or I want to collect or write on them." That's something a lot of restaurants have started either refusing to do that, or they'll smash the bottles. So if someone brings in a really rare wine, that they might destroy the actual bottle, just so they know that that's done, that's out of circulation. There's not even a chance that someone might refill it and try to resell it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then there was something else too in restaurants. I mean, oh, and then supposedly, and this was on Guildsom, and who knows how much to trust members on Guildsom, which is a, a website for wine professionals. But allegedly, there's restaurant owners who have sold really rare and expensive bottles and then have refilled them and resold them, even in the same restaurant. And the reason they found out is because the same person went in and bought the same bottle multiple times and noticed it was the exact same bottle number, like bin number and everything. So there are, the thing is, there's going to be shady people everywhere trying to manipulate the system. But again, it's being as a som, it's still really hard. There are little tricks to just know, like, she was talking about, I think she mentioned this in the movie Maureen again, that everything should match. If it's an old wine, the label and the cork and the capsule, the bottle should all show the same amount of aging or amount of deterioration. And if you have something that's really, really bright label or something, but it doesn't match, then that should be a signal. So, oh, have you tasted a good fake wine before? Probably. I mean, now that I know that there's so much fake wine out there, I feel like there's going to be, I'm sure I've tasted something. But knowingly, I don't know. I don't know if I've tasted a fake wine knowingly. I'll have to think back, but that's a good question. Yeah, Mark and Robin.
Eli, I wondered if, in currencies now, they do holograms and all sorts of interesting little things to prevent counterfeiting. Do any labels add counterfeiting tricks such as holograms to make sure the label cannot be copied?
Yeah, and that's starting to happen a lot more. Both holograms on capsules, but also on bottles. A lot of them are using QR codes too, the little square QR codes that you can scan, and it helps for a lot of reasons. It helps with authentication, but also it can bring you to their website or other things for general information about the wine. So it helps in just general marketing terms. It's interesting though, the Maureen Downey again runs this group, and they're actually in the process of developing a new technology for this. And I was actually listening to a podcast where she was talking about what goes into it. And it was something about, they want to make sure there's something that protects both, going back to, you either change the wine or the label. It protects both the capsules, so you can tell if it's the original capsule, but also you can tell if the capsule or the cork has been punctured. Like if you think of a Coravin, there's ways to get wine out of the bottle, but they've developed, it's something where there's going to be some sort of seal that will go on top of between the capsule and the cork, that will have both what's called RFID, the radio frequency ID chip in it. So it's like a microchip, kind of like what we have in our cat, that can be scanned, and so that way they can track things, and it can be scanned no matter where it's gone. But then there's also some imprint that has diamond dust in it, and she was saying something about the diamond dust, the way that it settles, it's actually unique. It's almost like a fingerprint, that it can be unique for every single one, and so that if it is punctured with a Coravin, any sort of needle or any contraption, you can tell it's been tampered with, because when you look at that diamond dust seal or whatever it is, it'll be altered. So there are technologies that they're using. That's still like in a beta phase, so it's not out there yet. But she's definitely leading the way on trying to find something that will work for a long time, because a lot of this is, the wines being bottled now might be up for auction in 50 years, 60 years. So it has to still kind of work with whatever technology that is out there. So, but I'll look in there. I'm sure there's other things people are doing. What are they called? Watermarks in labels too is becoming a lot more popular. A lot more just metallic ink embossing. Anything you can do, almost like money printing. Anything you can do to make it a lot harder to counterfeit. You're starting to see labels and capsules that have more of that technology. What's the oldest wine I've had? Ooh. I've had Bordeaux from oh, what was, I mean, I've had Bordeaux from the 60s, and I want to say there was a 40, maybe was it a 40 something Latoche? We did an aged wine tasting at Canlis a year and a half or 2 years ago, or it's COVID, so maybe it was 10 years ago. I don't know. And we definitely had some old wines, but I have them in my notes and I forget what year, but I've had some wines that are definitely over 60 years old. Jan asks, if wine is defined as being made of grapes, what should dandelion wine, fruit wine, etc. be called? It's a good question. I know that I think it depends on what country you're in, depends on what laws dictate what. I think there are levels for fruit wine or fruit. I don't know if there's a different term, whether it's, fruit beverage or anything like that. But I'll look, because I know that there's something in U.S. wine law to distinguish between at least fruit, the grape versus other fruits. Dandelion would be interesting because I'm not sure what that would be considered, or if it would just be considered an aroma or some sort of beer, or yeah, that's a good question. I'll look that up. Casey asks, with all these fraud possibilities, would you actually consider buying a sought-after wine at auction? Not even to mention storage. Oh yeah, and storage. Again, yeah, provenance is part of that equation. I personally don't ever plan on having that much money. I don't think I'll ever run into that much money to play at these auctions. And to me, I don't know if I get the same satisfaction out of that kind of wine buying. It's like, and going back to the art discussion, it's a lot of times I think it's a certain pride, or a certain you get something different out of it. And going and also talking about investment wine, the fact that a lot of these wines are never going to be drank. These are wines that people are going to want to either show off in their cellar, or they're planning on buying them so that they can resell them when they're worth more money as an investment, and get that money back, or make a lot of money off of it. And like any investment opportunity, there's definitely risks involved, and I don't know if I personally want to be that risky. But it is interesting. It's interesting too that you can make a lot of parallels to the art world with fraudulent art or fake art. But the difference is, we also have to be really careful, because you don't eat art. At least most art you don't actually consume and put in your body, whereas wine is meant to be consumed. Like, the whole point is that it's a beverage. And so when there is fraudulent or fake wine, it can also lead into maybe a more dangerous place, where you have chemicals like diethylene glycol and things that might mess with you. And so I don't know. I know that was a rambling answer to that question, but it is interesting. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about this idea of what's really, where's the value in art, or where's the value in really rare bottles of wine? Because I think a lot of times it's more about the history. It's more about owning a piece of history, and less about having this wine's going to taste so great, because it might not.
Yeah, I mean, if I had that kind of money, I can see myself maybe potentially buying pieces of art that I could gaze at, that I loved the artist or what have you. But I think that I agree with you that the interest in wine is about the taste for me, and the experience of drinking it, whereas the experience of art often is about gazing at, which you could do if you were a Coke,
Yeah.
which we weren't born into.
No, we weren't. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. Any other comments or thoughts about the movie? I thought the movie was well done. Robin, yeah.
It was just one of the things that struck us was the scene in the bar where they had this very expensive wine and they gave it to the woman behind the bar, and she said, "Oh, this was just so wonderful." And then the other man tasted it and he said it was like skunk water. That you could get such diverse thoughts about what this wine or tastes. That just, to me, that amazes me.
Yeah, that scene also kind of, it shocked me, but also didn't surprise me. And the reason is because, first of all, the fact that they were just wandering into a business with an open container and being like, try this wine, tell us what you think. I have a whole other issue with that style of being a human. But a lot of times in those circles, you have people who, and when you think about the staff members so people who worked in this wine bar, I don't know which wine bar that was. I have to look that up. But it when you're in front of very influential people with a lot of money that will have these kind of wines, this might be like the woman who tasted. Who knows? That might have been the first time she's ever tasted that. I think it was a La Mouline, the Guigal Côte Northern Rhone Syrah. It's incredible. It's an incredible wine, and if you're given the opportunity to taste this and need to on the spot decide, oh, is this real? It's real. I'm feeling pressure right now, even just thinking about being put in that position. But you can also imagine people who thrive on that pressure or thrive and want to feel like they're influential in that decision. And so you have a guy coming and be like, oh, I drink this all the time. This tastes like skunk water. There's no way this is a real wine. There's almost this posturing that's hard to know exactly what their experience is. I mean, and again, everyone's mouth is different. So it's very possible, even in tasting groups I've been a part of, where I've really, really loved a wine and someone else has been like, oh, this is terrible. And that's just the reality. That's the nature of it. So, but yeah, that was an odd scene. But again, there are people that probably drink a lot of that particular wine that maybe have a case in their cellar that they've been tasting every year and are really familiar and intimate with that bottle that might be able to tell you, oh yeah, this doesn't taste right. But the chance that someone working at a wine bar will have that knowledge right on hand for that like that, I don't know if I believe it. So yeah, Mary Margaret.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was gonna go to a new topic. So Renee, you respond.
When the guy that called it skunk water, when he said what the real wine should taste like, and he said that it should taste like a BLT with an egg on top, that doesn't sound appealing to me in a wine. And so I was just kind of wondering, as a sommelier, when you hear someone describe a wine like that, you're like, what are they trying? Just, does it really taste like egg and bacon and what does that mean?
I mean, I guess I can. First of all, I think it's just a way to not show off, but it is kind of a way, again, to posture yourself as having something to say, which in the wine business we do that. That's just something we do in all levels. But more specifically about that, I guess if I was going to say a BLT with an egg on it, then yeah, I mean, Syrah is known for having bacon fat. That's a bacon and meatiness is a flavor you'll get in Syrah. Maybe, with a little green lettucey note and a savory umami type tomato thing. And then I know the egg or egg yolk is all just about richness. And there is such a richness because that wine also is aged in 100% new French oak, which is it's not like most other Northern Rhone Syrahs. It's very unique, but it does have this incredible texture. So that could be what he's going for, is he's trying to describe, might be trying to describe that actual wine, but also I'm just kind of like, oh, come on, BLT with egg, come on. So, yeah. Mary Margaret.
One thing that really struck me watching the movie was just the whole environment of these rich investment guys that in this incredibly sexist, incredibly male dominate, and it's yeah. It had to be intentional, in terms of the way in which the movie was made, because they really drew it out. And I thought, oh my God, you could not be in an auction house now and try and describe wines the way this guy was describing them. I mean, it's just such a different time now. So that really struck me as well.
Well, and I hope it's such a different time now too. I think the thing, and I don't have experience at these auctions, but there are very misogynistic people in the biz at that level, I think, who lean into that. But I had the same experience when Shelley and I sat down to watch it. Shelly, we were cringing for the whole opening sequence and just that whole start of it where you're just kind of like, oh, I don't even want to be a part of this whole thing. I've started referring to it as like the Hunger Games, and I'll explain myself. Or if you're familiar with the Hunger Games, and I may or may not be listening to the sequel right now on audiobook, but in the Hunger Games, it's the idea that you have this elite class of people that are watching this arena or watching, these tributes from districts kill each other, and it's something that's so separate that you like I'm just going to keep drinking this cocktail and watching this amazing thing that is just so fascinating and I don't understand, but it doesn't affect me. And I had the same experience where I was like, look at all these really wealthy, filthy rich people who are buying these extremely rare wines, and oh look, they're like faking each other out, and now they're suing each other, and I'm like, this is fascinating, kind of like a Hunger Games, and and I don't know how if any of you felt that way, but there was kind of a Schadenfreude moment of like, yeah, well, if you describe wines like that in the way you were describing them in those emails, like I want you to get screwed. Like I don't want you to make any money off of wine, and especially not now. So yeah, I had the same experience. Didn't know I was going on a Hunger Games tangent, but I did. So, oh well, I know we're getting close to 5:30. Were there any other comments or any other questions for you before we wrap up? Well, this is fun. Oh yeah, Robin.
Eli, I just had one more question.
Yeah.
I just had one more question about, does any, in the old days, they counterfeited money. They did $100 bills. But now people are careful with fund hundreds. It's hard to launder them. But now people do counterfeit 20s, 10s, and 5s. It's just a slower process. Does anyone counterfeit regular wine? $10, $20 bottle of wine?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why is because the super rare, all the specialists now who have made a living like Maureen Downey in identifying the really expensive rare bottles. There's not a lot of professionals who are watching the cheap, the value wine section of the grocery aisle and noticing like what's happening. So I think, and that's when I was making the point of organized crime. I think there's a lot more attention now paid to that level of the wine business because even though it might be a low dollar amount, the margin might be worth it to get in there and create some mess. So
I did see 5 years ago they had a horrible problem with olive oil.
Oh, really?
Counterfeit olive oil.
Yeah.
And because the markup for certain brands is really high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's who knows? I mean, anything that's in, I guess, I don't know if olive oil, but like being in a luxury category of anything, you can find opportunities to inflate and in fraud. Well, that's not a word. I just made it up. But yeah. So, good point. Well, thanks everybody. That was fun. April Fools. I guess we're just supposed to yell that today. That's how that day goes. Happy April Fool's Day. Next week, I hope you get a chance to maybe open some bubbles. It can be bubbles from anywhere because we'll talk about sparkling wine and the different methods of making it, different places where you might get it, sparkling dessert wines, sparkling dry wines, all of it. It'll be super fun. So I hope to see you all back then. But thanks again for joining. And I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, a wonderful week ahead of you. And go get your vaccine if you haven't. I know more and more people are eligible. So now's the time. We got this. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Eli.
Bye. Thank you.